When my husband told me I'd never really supported him, I smiled instead of crying. It wasn't because his words didn't hurt. They did, more deeply than he'll ever know. I smiled because, in that moment, I finally understood something I'd spent years trying to ignore. People don't always forget because they want to. Sometimes, they forget because remembering makes them uncomfortable. And my husband, he had a lot to forget. I remember standing in the kitchen that night. The rain was tapping softly against the window, and the smell of soup filled the air. It was the same meal I had made 1,000 times before, simple, warm, familiar. He came in from work, shoulders heavy with exhaustion, eyes glued to his phone. He didn't even look at me. He just said, "You wouldn't understand what it's like to work this hard." The spoon in my hand froze mid-stir. For a second, I thought he was joking. I laughed, a small, nervous laugh that never reached my eyes. But when he didn't smile back, something inside me fell quiet. I didn't remind him of the nights I stayed awake, sewing his shirts, when we couldn't afford new ones. I didn't remind him how I worked double shifts at the diner so he could finish school. I didn't say how I carried both of us, through sickness, through rent overdue, through dreams half built and half forgotten. I just said, "You're right, maybe I wouldn't understand." That's what you do when love turns into habit. You stop defending yourself. You stop asking to be seen. I wish I could tell you that was the first time he'd said something like that, but it was. It was just the first time I realized I was disappearing. That night, as he scrolled through messages from colleagues and I quietly placed dinner on the table, I felt something break, not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, like the sound of fabric tearing. Love, I've learned, doesn't always end in shouting. Sometimes it ends in silence. And that silence, that quiet, empty space between two people who once promised each other the world, became my home for a long time. Before all the silence, there was laughter. The kind that fills a house, so completely you forget what loneliness sounds like. When I first met Daniel, he wasn't the man who now eats dinner with his phone in hand. He was bright, full of dreams, always talking about the future. I used to tease him for how seriously he took everything. He'd laugh and say, "Someone has to plan our happily ever after." We met at a small library downtown. I was returning a book I hadn't even finished reading, something about courage and second chances. He was sitting by the window, a stack of accounting books in front of him, frowning at a calculator that clearly wasn't cooperating. I don't know what made me walk over. Maybe it was the way his brow furrowed, or maybe it was just curiosity. But I remember asking, "Do you ever stop working?" He looked up, startled, then smiled. Only when someone interrupts me. That smile, it's the one I still remember when things get too heavy. We started talking, and talking turned into coffee. Then coffee turned into long walks. Then long walks turned into something that felt a lot like forever. He wasn't rich, and I wasn't either. But we had big dreams. He wanted to open his own firm one day, and I wanted to teach. We talked about having a little house with white curtains and a garden out front. We didn't care that the world called us foolish. We had love, and that was enough. At least, back then it was. When we got married, we had almost nothing. A few pieces of old furniture from my parents, a hand-me-down refrigerator that hummed louder than it cooled, and a single couch we'd found at a thrift store. But we had each other. I remember our first night in that apartment. The electricity went out halfway through dinner. Instead of panicking, we lit candles and laughed about it. We made up stories about the flickering shadows on the wall. His shadow was always the brave one, and mine was the dreamer. We promised that no matter how hard things got, we'd never forget that feeling. That closeness, that team we used to be. And for a while, we kept that promise. He'd come home from work with tired eyes but a soft smile. I'd have dinner waiting, and we'd talk for hours. Sometimes we'd share a single cup of tea just to stretch the groceries for the week. Sometimes he'd pull me close and whisper, "We're going to make it, I promise." I believed him. Completely. When I found out I was pregnant, things changed, but not in the way you might expect. He was happy, of course. Nervous, but happy. He held my hands, kissed my forehead, and said, "You're going to be the best mother in the world." And I believed that too. Those 9 months were hard. He was working longer hours, trying to save enough for the baby. I was at home, stitching tiny clothes by hand, trying to make our small apartment feel ready for someone new. When our son, Matthew, was born, I saw a new side of Daniel. He cried when he held him for the first time. His voice broke as he said, "He's so small." For a while, everything felt perfect again. We took turns staying up at night, rocking Matthew when he cried. Daniel would sing badly just to make me laugh through my exhaustion. We were still poor, still struggling, but there was so much love between us that it didn't seem to matter. But time has a way of changing people, doesn't it? Dreams that once united us started to divide us. Daniel's job became more demanding. He moved from one firm to another, chasing promotions, chasing recognition. I understood, I really did. We had bills to pay, a child to raise. I supported him in every way I could. I picked up part-time jobs, waitressing, tutoring, cleaning, anything that helped us stay afloat. There were days I came home so tired I couldn't feel my legs. Still, I cooked, I cleaned, I smiled. Because I wanted him to see that I was with him, no matter what. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing it. He stopped seeing me. He started coming home later and later. Sometimes he'd eat dinner alone, sometimes not at all. When I'd ask about his day, he'd answer with a few short words, his eyes never leaving his phone or the TV. When I mentioned how much I missed talking to him, he'd sigh and say, "I'm tired, okay? Can we not do this right now?" So I stopped asking. I started filling the silence myself, talking to Matthew, humming to the radio, pretending it didn't hurt. One night, I found an old photo album while cleaning. It was from our early days, our wedding, our first apartment, even that candle-lit dinner during the blackout. I left it open on the table, hoping he'd see it and remember. When he came home, he glanced at it once, then turned away. "Why do you keep holding on to these old things?" he asked. I said softly, "Because they remind me of who we were." He didn't reply, just walked to the bedroom and shut the door. The distance between us grew like dust, slowly, quietly, until one day I realized it had covered everything. He began to change in small ways. He stopped saying we. It became I. I got promoted. I bought the new car. I worked for this. And each time I clapped and smiled, even when my heart sank. Because that's what wives do, right? They celebrate quietly. But inside, I was fatting. I remember standing in front of the mirror one morning. My hair was graying at the edges, and the lines on my face seemed deeper than I remembered. I barely recognized myself. That day, Matthew came running in, holding one of his father's ties. "Mom, can you help me make it neat like Dad does?" I smiled and knelt down, helping him. As I tied it around his tiny neck, I realized how quickly time had passed. My baby was growing, and so was the space between his parents. I told myself it was just a phase, that things would get better once Daniel's work settled down. But deep down, I knew. Something had already shifted. He was chasing a life we'd once dreamed of together, but now he was living it alone. Still, I stayed patient. I waited for the man I fell in love with to come back. Because love, at least to me, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about the small things, the way we used to share our worries, laugh over burnt toast, hold hands in silence. But Daniel didn't see those moments anymore. He saw only what he hadn't achieved yet, and I became just another part of the background. There's a certain kind of loneliness that exists even when you're not alone. It's the loneliness of being unseen, unheard, unappreciated. I lived in that silence for years, pretending everything was fine. Because when you love someone that deeply, you convince yourself that sacrifice is love. That silence is patience. That endurance is loyalty. But love, I've learned, can't breathe when only one person remembers to keep it alive. That was the world I lived in before the words that changed everything. The night he said I'd never really supported him. Those words didn't come out of nowhere. They were the result of years of small wounds that neither of us noticed until they became scars. I didn't know it yet, but that moment would be the beginning of the end. And the start of finding myself again. They say marriages don't break overnight. They fade, one misunderstanding at a time, one unspoken word after another. Looking back, I can't point to a single day when everything fell apart. It was more like slow erosion, the kind you don't notice until one morning you wake up and realize the shore is gone. After that night, the night Daniel said I'd never supported him, something changed inside me. Not all at once, just quietly. I still woke up early to make breakfast. I still packed his lunch. I still smiled when he left for work, but my smile didn't reach my heart anymore. He didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, but he was too busy pretending not to. For years, our conversations had been about what's next. His next project, his next bonus, his next promotion. But there was no next for us. When I tried to talk about Matthew, his grades, his drawings, his new hobby of building tiny airplanes, Daniel would nod distractedly, his eyes fixed on his laptop. "That's great," he'd say without looking up. It broke my heart, not because he wasn't listening, but because he used to. There was a time when he'd rush home just to hear about Matthew's first word or his first step. Now, those stories had become background noise to him. I remember one Saturday morning. Matthew had been working all week on a drawing for his father, a picture of our family. He'd spent hours coloring every detail, the small blue house, the flowers in front, even the tie Daniel wore to work. When Daniel came home that evening, Matthew ran to him, holding up the picture proudly. "Dad, look, I made this for you." Daniel barely glanced at it. "Later, buddy, I need to finish something first." He walked straight to his office room. I watched as Matthew's little shoulders drooped. He turned to me and whispered, "Maybe he'll like the next one better." That night, after Matthew went to bed, I walked into Daniel's office. He was typing, eyes glued to the screen. I placed the drawing on his desk. "Matthew made this for you," I said softly. He sighed. "Can you not, please? I'm under pressure, okay?" I wanted to scream, "Pressure. You think I don't know what pressure feels like?" But instead, I nodded, turned around and quietly closed the door. That's when I realized I was starting to disappear not just as his wife, but as the mother of his child. Months passed like that. Days blurred into one another. Daniel's career was thriving, awards, bonuses, recognition. He'd worked hard, yes, but so had I only. My work didn't come with applause. My work was invisible. The clean clothes folded neatly in his drawers, the warm meals on the table, the love I poured into every corner of that house. But invisibility, I learned, is heavy. It wears you down slowly. One evening, I found myself standing by the window, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in soft oranges and pinks, and for a moment, it reminded me of when we were young, when we'd sit together on that thrift store couch, planning our future. Now I watched it alone, and the silence between us was louder than ever. One night, Daniel came home later than usual. I could tell he'd been drinking, not much, but enough to loosen his tongue. He dropped his bag on the chair and said, "You know, sometimes I feel like I'm doing all of this alone." The words stung. I turned from the stove, trying to steady my voice. "Alone. Daniel, I've been beside you since day one." He laughed bitterly. "Beside me? You haven't done anything for years. I'm the one keeping this house running." I froze. The words cut deeper than he knew. I wanted to remind him of everything. The nights I worked while he studied, the sacrifices, the dreams we once shared. But I didn't. Instead, I said quietly, "Maybe you've forgotten what partnership means." He didn't answer. He just took his plate and went to the living room, turning on the TV like nothing had happened. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The space beside me felt colder than usual. I whispered to myself, he doesn't mean it. He's just tired. But part of me knew better. As time went on, even small gestures felt forced. I'd ask, "How was your day?" He'd reply, "Same as always." When he got a big promotion, I cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with lemon and rosemary. I set the table with candles, hopping to surprise him. But when he came home, he said, "We're going out with the team, don't wait up." I smiled and said, "Of course." After he left, I sat at that table alone. The food went cold. The candles melted into silence. It wasn't the first time I'd eaten dinner alone, but that night, it felt different. It felt final, like something sacred between us had quietly ended. A few days later, I got sick. Nothing serious at first, just fatigue, dizziness, a fever that wouldn't go away. I thought Daniel would notice, that he'd ask if I was okay. But he didn't. He'd rush out in the mornings, before I woke up and come home long after I'd gone to bed. One morning, Matthew looked at me with worry in his little eyes. "Mom, you look pale. Did Dad see you?" I smiled weakly. "He's busy, sweetheart, don't worry." That night, I fainted in the kitchen. When I opened my eyes, I was on the couch. Daniel was sitting beside me, his expression unreadable. "You should take better care of yourself," he said. "I can't deal with this right now." Deal with this. Those words echoed in my head long after he'd gone upstairs. I wasn't his partner anymore. I was a problem to be managed. After that, I stopped trying. Not out of anger, just exhaustion. I stopped leaving notes in his briefcase. I stopped waiting up at night. I stopped making his favorite meals. And he didn't notice. That was the part that hurt the most. It was as if all my years of love had turned invisible, erased by his ambition, his pride, his selective memory. Sometimes, I'd hear him talking on the phone late at night, laughing, his voice light and alive in a way I hadn't heard in years. I never asked who he was talking to. I didn't want to know. Because if I knew, I'd have to face the truth. He didn't need me anymore. One evening, Matthew came home from school looking upset. "What's wrong, honey?" I asked. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Dad didn't come to my school event again. The other dads were there." I swallowed hard. "I'm sure he wanted to be there," I said. "He's just busy." Matthew nodded, trying to be brave. But that night, I found him asleep at his desk, clutching a drawing of our family. Except this time, Daniel's figure was faded, drawn with a lighter pencil. I stood there for a long time, tears streaming down my face. Because that was exactly how I felt too, like I was slowly erasing him from my heart, even as I wished he'd notice. Then came the night that changed everything. It was raining, the same gentle rain from the night he said those words to me. He came home late again, soaked and irritable. I had been waiting, dinner cold on the table. "Daniel," I said softly, "we need to talk." He didn't even take off his coat. "Not tonight. I've had a long day." "Please," I said, my voice trembling. "Just 5 minutes." He sighed heavily, threw his bag on the couch, and looked at me like I was a stranger. "What now?" I took a deep breath. "Do you even see me anymore? Do you remember how hard we worked to build this life? The nights I stayed up so you could study, the jobs I took so we could survive. You talk like you've done everything alone, but—" He cut me off sharply. "Oh, here we go again, the guilt trip. I'm tired of hearing how you helped me. You didn't make me successful, I did that on my own." The words hit harder than I expected. I stared at him, my hands shaking. He wasn't shouting. He didn't have to. The calmness in his voice made it worse. I whispered, "I never wanted credit, Daniel. I just wanted to be remembered." He turned away, muttering, "You should have done more if you wanted to be remembered." And just like that, the man I had loved for 20 years disappeared behind those words. After he went upstairs, I sat at the table for hours, the rain still falling outside. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed love could survive anything. The one who believed her sacrifices mattered. I thought about the promises we'd made, the laughter, the candlelit dinners, the dreams we'd built together. And I realized, in that quiet, heartbreaking moment, he had forgotten all of it. Not because he didn't care, but because he had outgrown the version of himself who needed me. That night, as the rain fell harder, I whispered a truth I had been avoiding for years. You can't hold on to someone who's already let go. The night he said those words, "You should have done more if you wanted to be remembered," something inside me quietly broke. Not the kind of break that makes you scream or cry. It was softer than that, like a thread snapping after holding too much weight for too long. I sat in the dark for a long time after he went upstairs. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall, a sound I'd always found comforting, but now it felt like a countdown. I wasn't sure what it was counting down to, but I knew something was ending. The next morning, I woke up before dawn. The rain had stopped, and a faint mist hung over the yard. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the world slowly wake up, the streetlights flickering off, the first birds calling, the light creeping gently across the floor. I used to love mornings. They felt like a fresh start, a quiet reminder that life moves forward no matter what. But that morning, everything felt heavy. When Daniel came downstairs, I greeted him the same way I always did. "Good morning." He nodded, poured himself coffee, and sat down without a word. I watched him for a moment, his shoulders hunched over his phone, his eyes tired but determined. There was once a time I could look at him and feel warmth. Now, all I felt was distance. "Daniel," I said softly. He didn't look up. Do you remember our first apartment?" He frowned. "What about it?" "I was just thinking about how we used to light candles when the power went out. You'd make shadow stories on the wall. Remember that?" He gave a faint, distracted chuckle. "Yeah, those were simpler times." Simpler times. He said it the way people talk about old photographs. Something far away, untouchable, irrelevant. I nodded, pretending to smile. But inside, I knew that whatever we had built together had already turned into memory for him. That day, I started packing boxes. Not to leave, not yet, but to sort through the pieces of a life that had become too cluttered with what-ifs and almosts. I found old letters we had written to each other, back when he still called me his world. I found a photo of us holding Matthew as a baby, both of us laughing at something the camera didn't catch. I sat there for hours, surrounded by pieces of the life I had built around him. Every photo, every memory, felt like a reminder of the woman I used to be, hopeful, proud, loved. I realized I had spent so many years trying to hold our marriage together that I had forgotten to hold on to myself. That evening, Daniel came home early for once. I had made soup, the same one from the night he said those hurtful words. He walked in, set his briefcase down, and said, "You're quiet lately, something wrong?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel angry or sad. I just felt done. "I'm just tired," I said. He nodded. "Work been crazy, it'll calm down soon." He didn't realize I wasn't talking about that kind of tired. As he ate, I studied the man in front of me, the man I had loved for 2 decades. He hadn't changed as much as I thought. The lines on his face were deeper, his hair a little thinner, but he was still Daniel, the man I'd once believed could move mountains. The only difference was that now, the mountains he was climbing had no room for me. After dinner, I walked into our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the drawer of my nightstand and pulled out an old notebook, the one I used to write in when times were hard. I flipped through the pages, reading the words of my younger self. Entries filled with hope, with dreams of what our future would be. Then I reached the last page I'd written, dated almost 5 years ago. It said, "Today, Daniel got another promotion. I'm proud of him. I just hope he remembers we're in this together." I smiled bitterly. He hadn't remembered. I closed the notebook and whispered to myself, "It's time." That weekend, Matthew went to stay with my sister. I told him I needed to clean the house and sort through old things. He hugged me tightly before leaving and said, "Don't work too hard, Mom." I waited until he was gone before I started really cleaning, not just dusting shelves, but emptying drawers, sorting closets, peeling back layers of our life. I found Daniel's old college jacket, the one I used to wear when it was cold. It still smelled faintly of him. I found my wedding dress, folded neatly in a box. The lace had yellowed a little, but when I touched it, I could still remember how my heart raced the day I wore it. And I cried. Not loudly, just quiet tears that soaked into the fabric as I whispered, "Where did we go wrong?" That evening, Daniel came home early again. He saw the open boxes and frowned. "What's all this?" "Just organizing," I said. "We've collected too much over the years." He nodded absently, picking up an old photo frame. It was from our wedding day, both of us young, eyes shining, hands intertwined. For a second, something flickered in his expression. Maybe recognition, maybe guilt. But then he set the photo down and said, "You should throw these old things away. They just take up space." I stared at him, feeling something twist inside me. I wanted to scream, "This isn't just space, Daniel. This is our life, our love, our story." But instead, I just said, "You're right, maybe it's time." He smiled faintly, unaware of what I meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the sound of his breathing beside me. For years, that sound had comforted me. Now, it only reminded me of how far apart we'd grown, even while sharing the same bed. I turned my face toward the ceiling and thought about all the promises we'd made, and all the ones we'd silently broken. I realized something then, something simple yet painful. I couldn't make him remember me by staying. Love isn't proven by how much you endure. Sometimes, love means knowing when to stop holding on. The next morning, I woke up before him. The sunlight was soft, spilling across the floor. I packed a small bag, just a few clothes, my notebook, and a picture of Matthew. When Daniel came downstairs, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. He looked at me curiously. "You're up early." I nodded. "Yeah, I need to go somewhere today." He frowned. "Where?" "To my sister, just for a few days." "Is something wrong?" I took a deep breath. "No, Daniel, that's the thing. Everything's already wrong." He looked confused, then frustrated. "Can we not do this right now? I have a meeting." I smiled sadly. That's always been the problem, hasn't it? It's never the right time. He sighed, grabbed his keys, and said, "We'll talk later." And then he left. I watched him walk out the door, the same way he'd walked out of countless conversations before. But this time, I didn't feel sad. I felt free. At my sister's house, the air felt different, lighter somehow. She looked at me with worried eyes. "You okay?" I nodded. "I think I will be." For the first time in years, I spent the day doing nothing, no cleaning, no cooking, no pretending. Just sitting quietly, letting the silence heal me instead of suffocate me. That night, I wrote in my notebook again. Today, I remembered who I am. 3 days passed before Daniel called. When I answered, his voice sounded irritated. "So you're really not coming back?" "Not yet," I said softly. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You're overreacting. You always take things too personally." I closed my eyes, feeling tears gather but refusing to let them fall. "I'm not overreacting, Daniel. I just finally listened to myself." He sighed. "What do you want from me?" I thought about it for a moment, then said quietly, "I just wanted you to remember." Before he could respond, I hung up. That night I walked outside. The air was cool, the stars faint but steady. For years, I had defined my worth by how much I could give, how much I could endure. But standing there under that quiet sky, I realized something powerful. I didn't need him to remember to know that I had loved deeply, fully, truly. He had forgotten, yes, but I hadn't. And maybe that was enough for now. The next week, I received a message from him. Just a few words. When are you coming home? I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. I don't know if I can call it home anymore. No reply came after that. And strangely, I didn't feel empty. I felt peaceful. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for his acknowledgement. I was finding my own. Days turned into weeks. I began spending time in the garden behind my sister's house, planting small flowers, watering them each morning. There was something healing about watching life grow again. Every evening, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the wind. And sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I'd hear echoes of laughter from years ago hours before everything changed. I didn't hate him. That was the surprising part. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just felt sad for both of us. For the love we lost. For the memories he forgot. For the woman I stopped being to keep our world together. One afternoon, my sister found me sitting quietly in the garden. "You miss him," she said gently. I nodded. "I miss who he used to be." She placed a hand on my shoulder. "And what about who you used to be?" That question stayed with me long after she went inside. Who was I before I became just a wife, just a mother, just someone's support system? I was a woman who dreamed, who laughed, who believed she could build a life filled with love. And maybe, just maybe, I could be her again. That night, as I watched the sunset, I whispered into the quiet, "I forgive you, Daniel." Not because he asked for it, not because he deserved it, but because forgiveness was the only way to let myself live again. The first morning I woke up and didn't reach for my phone to see if Daniel had called felt strange. Not painful, just quiet. I lay there, listening to birds outside the window and realizing how much sound I had ignored for years. Life was still happening, even without him. At my sister's house, the days found their own rhythm. I cooked small meals, read books I once loved, and went on long walks through the neighborhood. People greeted me with smiles, and I smiled back. For the first time in years, I didn't have to pretend. Sometimes I'd still think about Daniel, what he might be doing if he'd eaten, if the house felt too big without me there. Old habits die slowly. But the ache had softened. It wasn't bitterness anymore, it was memory. One afternoon, I went to visit my old workplace, the small community center where I'd once volunteered before Matthew was born. When I stepped inside, the smell of old books and paint hit me like a wave of nostalgia. Mrs. Perez, the coordinator, gasped when she saw me. "Is that really you, Maria?" she said, pulling me into a hug. "It's been years." We sat down in her office, and she talked about how the center was short on teachers for the weekend reading program. Without thinking, I said, "I could help." Her eyes lit up. And just like that, a part of me I thought I'd lost came back to life. That weekend, I sat in a circle of children, reading stories aloud. Their laughter filled the room, bright and unfiltered. When I looked at their faces, I realized I hadn't smiled like that in a long time. After the session, one of the little girls tugged at my sleeve. "Miss Maria, you read like my mom does. She says stories make people remember things." Her words stayed with me all evening. Maybe that's what I was doing, remembering. Weeks turned into months. I didn't rush to go back home, and Daniel didn't rush to ask again. He sent a few messages at first, short ones. "How are you?" "Matthew asked about you." Then silence. At first, the quiet scared me. But soon, I realized it was giving me space to breathe. I started keeping a journal again. Every night, I'd write one thing I was grateful for. The smell of rain. Matthew's laughter over the phone. The sound of my own heartbeat when the world goes still. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt. It was like dusting off the corners of my soul. 3 months after I left, Daniel called. It was a Saturday morning. I was watering the plants when the phone rang. "Hey," he said. His voice sounded tired, almost fragile. "Hey," I replied, keeping my tone calm. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Matthew, been asking when you're coming back." "I'll visit soon," I said. "Maybe next weekend." He hesitated. "Maria, I've been thinking about everything." I stayed quiet, letting him speak. "I didn't realize how much you did, how much you gave up. The house feels empty without you." I closed my eyes. The words were ones I'd once begged to hear. But now they didn't feel like a reward. They just felt late. "I'm glad you're thinking about it," I said softly. "I messed up," he continued. "I thought I was building something for us, but somewhere along the way I started building it for me." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. "I can't change what I said," he whispered, "but I remember now all of it." Tears slipped down my cheeks, silent and steady. Because for the first time, he wasn't defending himself. He was just speaking from the heart. "I needed to hear that," I said quietly, "but I don't know if going back means things will be the same." "I know," he replied. "I just want a chance to make it right." When I hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching the sun filter through the trees. My heart was heavy, but not broken. Forgiveness was already blooming there, quiet and slow. That night, I called Matthew. He was so excited to hear my voice that he almost shouted into the phone. "Mom, Dad made pancakes today. They were terrible, but he tried." I laughed through tears. It was the first time in months I'd heard Daniel's effort spoken out loud. "Tell him," I said, smiling, "to use less flour next time." Matthew giggled. "Will you come home soon?" "Maybe," I said, "when the flowers in the garden start to bloom." He didn't understand what I meant, but he said, "Okay, Mom, I'll watch for them." A few weeks later, spring arrived. The garden at my sister's house was alive with color, soft pinks, bright yellows, and green everywhere. I took it as a sign. When I walked up to my old front door, I hesitated before knocking. Daniel opened it almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting nearby. He looked different, not physically, but there was something in his eyes, humility maybe, or regret. The silence between us wasn't as sharp as before. "Hi," I said simply. "Hi," he whispered. "You look good." "So do you." We stood there awkwardly for a moment, two people learning how to speak again. "Come in," he said finally. The house looked the same, but the air felt different. He had cleaned. The table was set for dinner, 2 plates instead of 1. I noticed a small vase with flowers, wild ones, unevenly cut but placed carefully in the center. He followed my gaze. "Matthew picked them for you." That's when I saw our son peeking from the hallway, eyes bright. "Mom," he shouted, running into my arms. I held him close, breathing him in, and whispered, "I missed you, sweetheart." He hugged me tight. "Dad said you were coming when the flowers came. They're here now." I looked at Daniel. He gave a small, nervous smile. He'd remembered. Dinner was quiet but comfortable. Daniel tried to make small talk, asked about my sister, the community center, the reading program. He listened this time, really listened. After Matthew went to bed, Daniel and I sat in the living room. The clock ticked softly in the background, a sound that no longer felt like a countdown but a heartbeat. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, "but I want to try again to build something better this time." I studied his face. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding behind pride or frustration. He looked human, vulnerable. "I already forgave you," I said quietly. "A long time ago, but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting." He nodded slowly. "I know. I don't want you to forget. I just want to be someone you can remember kindly again." His words felt sincere, and for the first time I believed him. Over the next few weeks, we began to talk, not about what went wrong, but about what could still go right. He started coming home early, cooking dinner sometimes, even helping Matthew with homework. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a fairy tale, but it was honest. One night, as we sat outside watching the stars, he said, "Do you ever think we can be what we were?" I thought for a moment. No, I said, but maybe we can be something new, something stronger. He nodded. I can live with that. There was peace in the quiet that followed, peace that didn't need to be earned or explained. Still, I knew something inside me had changed permanently. Love, once broken, never returns to the exact same shape. It softens, reshapes, becomes something gentler. And that was okay. I didn't need the grand romance anymore. I just needed respect, kindness, and truth. Daniel began to understand that too. He didn't make big speeches. He just started showing up, little by little, day after day. He helped with laundry. He washed the dishes. He said thank you. They were small things, but they mattered more than flowers or apologies. One evening, Matthew asked us to come to his school play. It was the same kind of event Daniel used to miss without a thought. But this time, he cleared his schedule, wore a clean shirt, and sat right beside me in the front row. When Matthew spotted us in the crowd, he grinned so wide I thought his cheeks would burst. After the play, as we walked home, Daniel whispered, I almost forgot what this felt like. I smiled gently, then don't forget again. He nodded, I won't. And somehow, I believed him. Months later, life had found its rhythm again, different, slower, but real. I still volunteered at the center. Daniel still worked, but he made time for dinners, for Matthew, for us. One evening, as we sat in the garden watching the sunset, he reached for my hand. I never thanked you, he said quietly, for everything you did before I even understood it. I squeezed his hand. You just did. He looked at me, eyes soft. I still don't deserve you. I smiled faintly. Maybe not, but you're trying, and that's enough. We sat there in silence, the world fading into soft twilight. Sometimes, when the rain falls at night, I still remember the version of us that used to exist. The laughter, the promises, the young love that built a life out of nothing. And though it hurts a little, I also feel gratitude. Because even if Daniel forgot who stood beside him, I never forgot the woman who did. And finding her again changed everything. I learned that love doesn't have to mean losing yourself. That silence can be broken by courage. And that forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't about going back. It's about moving forward with peace in your heart. It's been 2 years since that night, the night his words broke me open. Sometimes, when I walk past the old photo on our living room shelf, I still remember how small I felt that evening. But I don't carry the pain the same way anymore. It's softer now, more like a scar that reminds you where you've healed. Life didn't turn into a fairy tale after that. Daniel and I still have our quiet disagreements. There are days he forgets small things, like taking out the trash, or the way I like my tea. But he never forgets me anymore. And I think that's what matters most. He listens now. He asks about my day, about the children at the reading center, about what I'm writing in my journal. He says he likes the sound of my voice when I talk about things that make me happy. I never realized how much I missed being asked about my happiness. Matthew's growing fast. He's learned to make pancakes properly, though sometimes he still burns the first batch. Whenever I watch him laughing in the kitchen, I think about how close I came to disappearing from this home completely, and how much beauty I would have missed. The truth is, people forget. They forget kindness, effort, sacrifice. They forget who held them when they were weak, who stayed when things were falling apart. But sometimes, forgetting is part of learning. It hurts, yes, but it teaches both sides what they were taking for granted. Daniel's forgetting showed me something too. It showed me that love without self-respect is only half a love. And no matter how much you give, you can't fill someone's heart if you've emptied your own. I used to think being a good wife meant keeping everything together, smiling through exhaustion, saying it's fine when it wasn't, shrinking so he could stand taller. But now, I know love isn't about disappearing. It's about standing beside someone without losing the sound of your own heartbeat. One evening, as we sat in the garden, Daniel said something I'll never forget. He said, You know, I used to think strength meant never falling apart. But watching you rebuild yourself, I think strength is knowing when to start over. His words hung in the air, soft and sincere. And for the first time, I felt that we were finally standing on the same ground. I smiled and said, maybe we both learned something after all. He nodded, reaching for my hand, and we sat there, not as the couple we once were, but as two people still learning, still trying. That, to me, is love now. Not perfection. Not endless sacrifice. Just presence, steady, kind, and real. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the rain tapping on the window, just like that evening long ago. But instead of feeling lonely, I feel calm. Because I know I found myself again in that silence. And in finding me, I found the courage to rebuild what was broken piece by piece, heart by heart. If you're listening to this, and you've ever been unseen in your own home, please remember. Your love has value. Your effort matters. And sometimes, walking away isn't the end. It's the beginning of being remembered the right way. Soft piano returns. The tone fades into warmth. Love doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in forgiveness, in patience, in choosing to stay, not because you're trapped, but because you've healed enough to try again. And if life ever makes you feel invisible, look in the mirror and remember. You've been standing beside yourself all along. Music swells gently, then fades out. At the end,